third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning. It's lovely to see you. I'm Tamlin, and I'm part of the team here. And today we're going to look at Daniel 1. And thanks for reading that. So before we dig into the passage, I was wondering, what is the most courageous thing you've ever done? Is it maybe something adrenaline pumping, or is it maybe standing up and speaking in front of a crowd? What could it be? For myself, I was really fearful of heights as a child. And this caused quite a few problems, especially when you're on like a residential and then you've got to do all the high ropes, and that would just absolutely petrify me. But when I was in my, I think, latter teen years, I can't quite remember how old I was, we went to Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, which is a massive waterfall, and then there's the river and the gorge around there. And I decided that this was the moment to conquer my fear. There are loads of adrenaline pumping activities, such as a zip line and things like that, but then there was gorge swinging. Okay, so now imagine kind of like a swing in a playground, but more where you hold it on like a fireman's pole, where you hold onto that, you got a harness on. And this giant swing is 95 meters long, You're 120 meters above the water, which is the river, which is flowing pretty fast below you. And then you fall for 70 meters, free fall, and then you start swinging. Okay. For some reason, I decided this was my moment, and I was going to conquer my fear of heights. I was going to just be courageous and do it. And to the absolute shock of everyone else, I did. No one thought I would do it. Everyone thought I would chicken out at the last minute, but I didn't. And this took loads of courage. And why did it take so much courage? Because there was so much fear behind it. And I love how the Cambridge Dictionary describes courage, where they say, courage is the ability to control your fear in a dangerous or difficult situation. I had to control my fear in that moment, my fear of heights, to ultimately be courageous and overcome it. But I wonder, what are situations where you've had to be courageous in? It might not be something that adrenaline pumping or extreme like that. It might be having a difficult conversation. It might be something physical, like going through some medical treatment. I'm sure there are times when we've all had to be courageous. And these are moments that help us grow as people. And when I think of Daniel, I think of him as quite a courageous person. And the book of Daniel is a bit of a wild story. You might be familiar with some of the stories in it, you might not. But some of them are like Daniel and the lion's den. He's in the den and he doesn't get eaten. Or his 3 friends get put into a furnace and don't burn. There's another story in Daniel where there's a banquet and then a hand just starts writing on the wall. There's some wild stories in there. I highly recommend you reading it. It's only 12 chapters long, and we're going to look at it over the next few weeks. But who is Daniel? And what made him so courageous? And how does he fit into our lives today? What can we learn from him? So when we look at Daniel, we're going to look at Daniel chapter 1 today and just look a bit about who he is. We know he's part of the David's royal family. We know he's Jewish. He really wants to stand up for his belief and his religion. We know he's handsome. We know he's got incredible wisdom and insight. We know he can interpret dreams like no other magician in the land can. He's a man of faith. He's someone who gives control over to God. He doesn't live in fear and is courageous. And in chapter 1, we kind of see the plot of the rest of the book. There's this tension, and it's kind of this tension between the battle of gods. So we have Daniel's one true God, and then we have the Babylonian gods. And this is all happening in like 6th century BC. And at the time, the king was called King Nebuchadnezzar. And he had just declared war over Jerusalem and besieged the city. He even goes in, takes some of the things out of the temple, the holy temple, and puts it into his house for his gods. There are some real shocking things that he did. But then he says to his chief of staff, you know what, go and get me some Israelites, some men who are from the royal family, who are from nobility. And they have to, there's quite a list he goes through. He says they have to be healthy, handsome, intelligent, well-educated, prospects of leadership in government. As the Message translation says, perfect specimens. And take those men and indoctrinate them into this Babylonian culture and society, into magic and fortune-telling. And part of that is going to be training for 3 years, with the goal of taking these Jewish young men to leave their Hebrew culture, to leave their Hebrew God, and to become more like the Babylonians, to seek wisdom from Nebuchadnezzar, to kind of look to King Nebuchadnezzar for everything. And Daniel and 3 of his friends were chosen by the chief of staff. And part of that was this training they had to do, but they also had to change their names, which was interesting was that the names they originally had all linked to, had some reference to God, the one true God. And then they get changed, their names get changed to names that all reference Babylonian gods. And part of this training, the king is very specific about what they can eat. And that's where we find today ourselves in this passage. And in those days, that would have been a really great honor, because what the king ate and what everyone else ate was like a massive difference. We're not just talking like Tesco's versus like Fortnum and Mason. Like, there was a really big difference. But part of that wasn't just what the actual food they were eating. It was giving up their identity. It was giving up their Jewish identity, violating the Jewish laws to live more like Babylonians. Now, there would have been massive pressure on Daniel to just kind of follow through, just go with what the king wanted. But he wanted to stay faithful to God. He wanted to stand up for his faith, for what he believed in. And through this passage, I saw two kind of themes in Daniel's personality. We saw how he is courageous, and because of that, he is then so countercultural in what he does. He's courageous in the decisions he makes, doesn't let fear drive him, and then he is countercultural in how he lives out his life. And we see God's grace that's bestowed upon him, lavished upon him, how he has favor in God's eyes. And you may be wondering, why is this issue around food such an issue? Why did he not kind of tackle the whole magic and fortune-telling side of things? As I said earlier, it was about him not wanting to defile himself, not wanting to go against his Jewish customs of the time. So there were three things. First of all, the food would not have been kosher, which is what would have had to have happened in those days as a Jewish man. Secondly, the food probably would have been sacrificed to idols or the Babylonian gods. And thirdly, if he eats the king's food, he's kind of saying, okay, I'm willing to be part of this Babylonian culture system. But what does Daniel do? He has courage and faces fear straight on, despite the danger and the difficult situation. He doesn't fear King Nebuchadnezzar. He puts his trust in the one true God. He believes that God's law is above the king's. And he has the courage to speak out about this. And I was quite challenged. I don't know if I would have necessarily. I don't know what you would have done in that situation. Because what do we see? It says in verse 8 to 10, it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of the Lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than any other man your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel was putting someone else's life in jeopardy. But what does he do? He knows that God has gone before him, that he has made the official have favor and compassion towards Daniel. He was not living in fear of King Nebuchadnezzar. And when we're talking about living in fear, specifically in like Bible times, it was not only being afraid of someone, but it's also holding someone in awe. It is being controlled by someone else or worshiping someone else, putting your trust in someone else, needing someone else more than God. And he wasn't willing to do that with King Nebuchadnezzar. He was willing to fear God more than fear the king. And what I mean by fear God is, in a sense, being, again, that awe, worshiping, trusting in the one true God. His fear of the Lord was greater than the fear of the king. And this concept really came to mind for me when I was a teenager, and someone gave me the book, When People Are Big and God is Small. And it looks at the fear of man, of when we put men kind of in that place of God and worry more about what others think of us than what God does. And this really helped me kind of, especially as a teenage girl, dig a little bit deeper into whose opinions and whose thoughts am I listening to. And this is something that I have to continually do, and I'm sure many of us do too. But we see how Daniel didn't live in that fear of man. He feared God more, even when it meant putting someone else's life at risk. He was courageous in what he did. But he was able to do this. Why? Because he knew God had gone before him. And this reminded me of Deuteronomy 31, where it's in verse 8, it says, "The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." He knew that God was going before him. And we see this kind of carry on in the rest of the passage, where he then says, please, just give me food and water to drink for 10 days. Let's see what happens. And what happens? That royal official agrees to that. And then at the end of the 10 days, they look even better than all the people who've had all the really good food and all the good wine. He stood up for his beliefs, and what incurred then was that he was acting counterculturally. He was going against that culture of the time. But what did he do? He did it with such a humility, such a poise, such a grace. We don't see him throwing an absolute fit. We don't see him yelling at the officials. We don't see him going on a hunger strike. We don't see him drawing all this unnecessary attention to himself. We don't see him going to the king and asking the king to go beyond and saying, "These are my dietary requirements." What do we see? We see Daniel choosing his battles wisely. We see how he still had that obedience and respect to authorities, but when it came to drawing the line at defiling his body, he was not willing to do that. He stood up for what he believed in. And he does it with respect. He respectfully asks, "Can I please have water and vegetables?" He doesn't demand anything. There's a real humility about him. There's a real patience. And when the situation seemed impossible, he knew that grace, God's grace, had been bestowed upon him. He knew that because of what he was able to stand up for his beliefs because of God's grace. And when I'm talking about God's grace, I'm talking about being given something we don't deserve. And what happens? We see how God gives him this understanding and this knowledge of all kinds of learning. He goes on to be able to interpret dreams and visions, which is really important later on in the book. And in verse 20, we see, "In every matter of wisdom and understanding, about which the king questioned him, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom." God had shown his grace upon Daniel, had given him knowledge and understanding. And this wasn't about Daniel earning God's grace. It wasn't because he did something that he got God's grace. It was because of God's grace he was then able to do these things, where he was able to stand up for what he believed in. And there's a book called The Gospel According to Daniel, and the author, Dr. Brian Chapwell, says, "Daniel acts on the grace God repeatedly provides. But God is always the one who first provides the opportunities, the resources, the rescue needed for Daniel's faithfulness. If we reverse the order and make God's grace dependent on Daniel's goodness, then we forsake the gospel message Daniel is telling and produce the hero worship of adventure tales rather than the divine worship of the gospel according to Daniel." Daniel is able to be courageous, to be countercultural, because he knew God had gone before him, because he knew that grace had been lavished upon him. And the same is true for us today. When we have a really impossible situation, when we are needing to stand up for our faith, we can do that. We can be courageous. We can be countercultural because we know God's grace has gone before us. And I think for us today, often standing up for what we believe in when it comes to scripture and our biblical understanding is that is opposite to what the world and society is saying. Just by doing that, we are being and living counterculturally. And we are able to do this because his grace has gone before us. So we know that Daniel is courageous. We know he lives counterculturally. But how does he do it? This couldn't have been easy. I think we all face fear, and Daniel must have had that sense of fear. But what do we know? We know from later on in the book, in chapter 6, it talks about how Daniel is a real man of prayer. In chapter 6, verse 10, it says, 3 times a day he got on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. We see this pattern of prayer in Daniel's life. We see how he is humble, how he doesn't just go in all guns blazing, ready to fight the authority. He chooses his battles wisely. He's a man of integrity. He doesn't just kind of go with the flow. He stands up for what he believes in. He knows what he believes in. He's a man of faith. And by that, he knows God's grace and that God has gone before him. He prayed. He knew his beliefs. He thought about these things. He put his faith in God and knew that everyone else, even when he knew everyone else was following other gods. And this resulted in him being a man of courage who was living counterculturally. And the more I thought about this week, I kind of thought about, I wonder who's like Daniels in our society. Who are maybe some of the big people that, people of great faith that I could use as an example. Maybe show a video of or something like that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it's not about that. It's about the everyday moments. And this is something my 2.5-year-old daughter reminded me of this week. And just to preface it first, she's fine, she's healthy, but over the last little while, she's had to have quite a lot of doctor's appointments and blood tests and things like that. And this created a real sense of fear inside of her. A fear of going to the doctor, a fear of having blood tests or a needle, anything like that. And it's quite hard to process as a 2.5-year-old. And so we really tried to put language to it and explain to her what was going on. And the result of this is that we use the word brave a lot, especially after we had been to the doctors. Emmy, you're really brave. You faced this, and this. And she would come home and she would often say, the first thing she would say when she saw her dad would be, I'm so brave, I'm brave. And that was language that really helped her. And we haven't spoken about it recently, but on Thursday I had to take our dog Wallace to the vet for his vaccinations. And I thought, okay, better do a little bit of preparation here before she sees some metal needles. And on the way, we spoke a lot about how the doggy doctor, the vet, is going to give Wally an injection. And, you've had injections before, and it's a needle and all of that. And as we go there, also, Wallace is a miniature dachshund, so he's pretty small, and probably the needle's like half the size of his body. Anyway, so I wasn't quite sure how this was all going to go. And she was standing next to me, and completely unprompted, she looked at me afterwards and said, Mummy, Wally's so brave. And why? For her, she was looking at that situation. She had a fear. She had a fear of those needles, of whatever the doctor was going to do, and especially to now her doggy. But she was able to face that. And she was able to use the words to say, Wally is so brave. And that really got me thinking. It's not about us being big Daniels and maybe, going to a lion's den. It's the everyday things. It's the things in our lives where we have to stand up for our faith in the small things, where we may have to face our fears, where we have to fear God more than we fear man. And I wondered, what if we were all a bit more like Daniel? If we prayed into our situations more? If we were humble about what we said and did? If we picked our battles wisely? If we hold onto the truth that God has gone before us, that his perfect love will cast out fear? What happens if we feared God more than we feared man? And this isn't easy, because fear is something that we can all easily get quite involved with and can take hold over certain aspects of our lives. But because of who God says he is, because his perfect love casts out fear, because of his grace, we are able to be courageous. We are able to live a countercultural life. So it got me wondering, what situation might you be in where maybe you need to take that step of praying courageously. Maybe having a difficult conversation with a spouse or a family member, where there's something that fear, some sort of fear that might be holding on to you. What step can you take to overcome that? Maybe it's a difficult work situation. Maybe it's a really difficult medical treatment that you're going through, or family is. But we know we can be courageous and act counterculturally because of who God is. And that is what Daniel does. So I'd love for us just to take a minute. So why don't we just stand? Just take a minute to think about maybe where's some of the fear in your life? Where are some of the things that are holding you back that you could be courageous in? What is that first step you could do to overcome that? I love 1 John 4 where it speaks about there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because of that, because of who Jesus is, we don't have to live in that fear. Just bring that before him now.
We've heard this before, I would imagine, but the most common command in the Bible is, do not be afraid. Apparently it occurs 365 times. But it's not a promise to take away fear. It's that in the place of fear, the promise that near enough always accompanies that command is, for I'm with you, never to leave you or forsake you. So, Father, make us aware that you are with us in that place of fear. However big or small it might be, fear never feels small, to be honest, but however it is, whatever it's directed at, help us to know that even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the darkest place, we'll fear no evil. Why? Because you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Your authority, that Jesus, you're in charge. There's nothing stronger than you. There's nothing greater than you. There's nothing that can overcome you. You have overcome sin, death, the grave, and that you're seated on the throne now. In a moment, we're going to share communion together, and would love us to come take bread and wine. And then if you'd like prayer, maybe it's prayer about fear. Maybe it's a particular thing you face. You're praying for healing or praying for someone else or work or home or wherever it might be is the fear that you're in or facing. And we just want to pray just that you be ever so aware of God's presence, that you be filled with his love that casts out fear. Constant reminder of we need him, but he is more than willing and able to draw alongside us. So in a moment, I want to invite you forward. And if you come for communion, take bread and wine, then you can head to the side afterwards to be prayed for. And as part of the ministry of the church, we bear with one another. We pray for one another. And we minister in the power of the Spirit. Had just a moment recently where, we all get moments when we feel fearful or worried about something. And a friend of mine sent through they've been praying and listening to God for me, which is very kind. And they sent me a prophetic word that was so accurate. I was slightly blown away. I don't think they realised quite how much it was. And one of the things I realised is if someone can send you something profound, but it still has to drop from here to here. It still has to get into your heart. And that's what we pray the Spirit will do. So when we pray for people, when we listen to God for one another, we're praying that the words that God speaks to us, through us, would absolutely hit our hearts and encourage us and strengthen us. So if you're coming forward to pray for people, just remember those little prophetic words that God will give, words of encouragement, can absolutely transform lives. As you know, we've had the challenge with the screens, and so there isn't going to be any liturgy for us to follow this morning. But I'm going to take us on the journey that the church takes when it comes to communion. We're going to begin just with a moment of confession, where we just open our hearts to God and bring before him anything that we need to say sorry for, anything that we need to confess, as we prepare our hearts to receive his grace. So, Father, thank you that you are welcoming and loving. That just as the Father greeted the prodigal son, you greet each one of us. And as the promise in Lamentations reminds us that because of your great love, we are not consumed. Your compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. So we bring before you now just those things we need to say sorry for, to receive new mercy for today. Father, thank you that you offer that gift of forgiveness to all who repent. That if we confess our sins, you're faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And that as far as the east is from the west, it's how far you remove them from us. We receive your forgiveness. And as we journey towards the table, that shared meal that you gave to your disciples, we remind ourselves of that meal. That on the night before he died, at supper with his friends, Jesus took bread. He gave thanks and said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he took the cup of wine and said, "This is my blood shed for you for the forgiveness of all sin. Every time you drink from this cup, do it in remembrance of me." And so, Father, we pray over these simple things, bread and juice and wine. And we pray, may they be to us something profound that reminds us of the wonder of your love demonstrated on the cross, the power of your forgiveness, and the freedom that you invite us into. And so together as the church, let's say those three lines that remind us about Jesus. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Christ has died, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. So, Father, pour out your Spirit upon us, that we may be renewed in your image, that we may take on more of your likeness, that we may receive more of your grace, reminded that we all come with empty hands, equal before the cross, but that you have a gift for each one of us to receive. Amen. So if those who are helping to give out communion could come forward, and we'll invite you forward in a moment to receive bread and wine. If you need gluten-free, just ask at the front. There's 2 chalices of cups of wine that you can drink from, or you can take a little glass which has got juice in instead. And then do stay for prayer if you'd like prayer, and there'll be folk who come forward who would love to pray for you. So yeah, if those who can helping do come forward now, and then we'll invite you up in a moment.